January 15th, 1947. Bremen Harbor, Germany. The wind off the North Sea was a physical blow, smelling of brine, damp ash, and the distant metallic tang of pulverized infrastructure. Erich Weber huddled deeper into his American-issued greatcoat. It felt too heavy, too clean for this gray, skeletal landscape. He shuffled forward in the repatriation line, the cobblestones slick with freezing rain. The processing was methodical, a stark American ritual of paperwork and stamping, ensuring orderly discharge amidst the German ruin. A commotion erupted nearby. A gaunt woman, clutching a small child wrapped in rags, stumbled on the icy cobbles. She instinctively curled her body over the child, shielding him from the wind and the trampling feet of the crowd. Her eyes met Erich's. They were sharp with hunger and suspicion. She looked pointedly at his sturdy American boots. "Amerikaner," she hissed, pulling the child closer. Erich flinched, feeling the weight of the Palmolive soap bar in his pocket. A fellow returnee beside him, an older corporal named Hans, muttered under his breath, "Don't worry, Weber. They are just happy to see us." The hostility was thicker than the fog. It makes you wonder how the definition of survival changes when the fighting stops. If you find these historical perspectives insightful, consider subscribing and sharing where you are watching from. 18 months earlier, Camp Hearn, Texas. The smell of roasted turkey and sweet potatoes hung heavy in the mess hall of Camp Hearn. It was November 1946, over a year since the surrender, yet the Texas air outside still held a stubborn warmth. Erich Weber pushed the slice of pumpkin pie around his tin plate. The vibrant orange filling, spiced with nutmeg and cinnamon, turned his stomach. It was Thanksgiving. The Americans insisted on the ritual, even for their prisoners. Around him, the other men ate, some with gusto, others with the same mechanical indifference they applied to all aspects of captivity. The repatriation lists had finally been posted, and the camp was slowly emptying. Their time in this strange, comfortable limbo was ending. The adherence to providing holiday meals, often noted in Red Cross inspections, was a cornerstone of the American approach to the Geneva Convention, though often controversial domestically. "You're not eating that?" Hans, the corporal from his barracks, pointed at the pie with his spoon. "It's too sweet," Erich murmured. He looked at the long tables laden with food, the mountains of white bread, the vats of gravy. He thought of the letters he'd received months ago, before the mail stopped entirely, hinting at the scarcity back home. "Rations are thin," his mother had written, the censor's black ink obscuring the details. Here, rations were plentiful. The cognitive dissonance was a constant, dull ache. He was safe, he was fed, and he felt profoundly guilty about it. "Suit yourself," Hans shrugged. "More for me." Erich watched him eat. He knew he should be grateful, but the abundance felt obscene. He slid his plate toward Hans and stood up, the wooden bench scraping against the concrete floor. He walked back toward the barracks, the afternoon light filtering through the screened windows. He needed something else, something practical to take back to a world where pumpkin pie meant nothing. In the camp canteen, he used the last of his work chits, money earned picking cotton in the humid fields of the Brazos Valley. He bypassed the cigarettes and the Coca-Cola. On the shelf behind the counter was a stack of green bars. "Soap," Erich said to the American private running the store, pointing. "Palmolive." The private handed him a bar. It was heavy, smooth, and smelled overwhelmingly of order and cleanliness. Back in his bunk, Erich took the soap and a piece of oilcloth he had scavenged. He wrapped it meticulously, securing the edges to protect it from the coming journey. This soap felt more valuable than the food. He imagined the voyage across the Atlantic, the arrival in Bremen, the look on his mother's face when he handed her this small piece of American luxury. The whistle blew for the afternoon count. Eric tucked the wrapped soap deep into his duffel bag. He was ready to go home. But the closer it got, the more the safety of the camp felt like a betrayal he would soon have to answer for. The warmth of Texas vanished the moment they were loaded into the hull of the Liberty ship. The vastness of the camp was replaced by tiered bunks stacked 5 high, so close together that a man could not sit up straight without hitting his head. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fuel, stagnant water in the bilges, and the collective odor of hundreds of unwashed bodies heading home. It was early January 1947, and the North Atlantic was relentless. The ship, designed for cargo rather than human comfort, groaned and pitched against the towering winter swells. Seasickness was rampant. The sounds of retching echoed constantly in the metallic confines of the hold, a miserable soundtrack to their repatriation. Eric found a lower bunk near the center of the ship, hoping the motion would be less severe there. He clutched his duffel bag, feeling the hard shape of the wrapped Palmolive soap inside. It felt like an artifact from another life. Hans had managed to secure the bunk next to him. The older corporal seemed unfazed by the conditions, having endured worse before his capture. He watched the younger men, their faces pale and glistening with cold sweat. "Not quite the Pullman car, eh, Weber?" Hans muttered, bracing himself as the ship rolled heavily. "I just want to breathe clean air," Eric said, his voice tight. "The air won't be cleaner where we're going," Hans replied flatly. He leaned closer, lowering his voice against the noise of the engines. "Listen to me. You spent too long in the sun. You have meat on your bones." Eric looked down at his hands. They were calloused from the cotton fields, but strong. His American-issued uniform was clean and intact. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that Germany is starving. Reports say this winter is the worst in a century. They have been eating boiled roots while we ate beef and played football." Hans's eyes were hard, devoid of sentiment. "When we land, try to look smaller, dirtier. Hide how healthy you look. They will hate you for it." The words landed with the weight of a physical blow. Eric had anticipated hardship, perhaps even chaos, but not hatred. He had thought of himself as a survivor, a soldier returning from the war. Now he realized he might be seen as something else entirely, a collaborator in his own survival. The safety that had sustained him in Texas suddenly felt like a dangerous liability. For the remainder of the voyage, Eric retreated into himself. He ate the meager rations provided on the ship, but the food tasted like ash. He tried to blend into the shadows of the hold, practicing the slouch of a defeated man. When the cry of "land sighted" finally came weeks later, in the gray light of a January morning, Eric felt no relief. He climbed the ladder to the deck. The coastline of Europe was visible on the horizon, a thin, frozen line under a bruised sky. It didn't look like a homecoming. January 15th, 1947. The gangplank was a treacherous sheet of ice connecting the Liberty ship to the quay. Eric descended carefully, his breath clouding in the frigid air. This was Bremen, or what was left of it. The harbor, once a testament to German industry, was a skeletal landscape. Cranes lay buckled like broken toys, and the hulls of half-sunk ships pierced the gray water of the Weser. The wind off the North Sea carried the smell of the city. Brine, damp ash, and the metallic tang of pulverized infrastructure. It was the smell Hans had predicted, the smell of defeat, far more potent than anything Eric had experienced in Texas. They were marshaled into long lines for processing. The operation was run with brisk efficiency by British soldiers. Bremen was utilized as a key port within the British occupation zone. They were issuing the Entlassungsschein, the discharge papers that officially turned them from prisoners of war back into German civilians. Eric shuffled forward, the cobblestones slick beneath his feet. He huddled deeper into his American-issued greatcoat. It felt conspicuously warm. its wool fibers thick and undamaged. He looked down at his boots. They too were American, sturdy leather, barely worn, designed for long marches across varied terrain. Here they felt clumsy and loud. Beyond the processing barriers, a crowd of civilians waited. They were watching the returnees, but there were no cheers, no waving flags. Eric searched their faces and found only a terrifying uniformity. They were gaunt, wrapped in threadbare coats and makeshift scarves. Their eyes, sunk deep in their sockets, seemed to scrutinize every man stepping off the ship, assessing their worth, their health. The contrast was sickening. Eric felt the weight of every meal he had eaten in Camp Hearn. A commotion erupted nearby. A woman, clutching a small child wrapped in rags, stumbled on the icy cobbles. She instinctively curled her body over the child, shielding him from the wind. As she righted herself, her eyes met Eric's. They were sharp, fueled by the desperate energy of the hunger winter. She didn't look at his face for long. Her gaze dropped immediately to his sturdy American boots. The contempt was instantaneous, visceral. "Amerikaner," she hissed, pulling the child closer, as if Eric himself were a threat. Eric flinched. The word was an accusation. He wasn't an American. He was a German soldier returning home. But in that moment, he understood. To her, he was the enemy who had been fed while her child starved. Hans appeared beside him, his own discharge papers in hand. "Don't worry, Weber," he muttered, his voice heavy with irony. "They are just happy to see us." The hostility was thicker than the fog. The idealized vision of home Eric had nurtured in Texas shattered completely. He took his papers from the British corporal without a word and walked past the barriers, leaving the relative order of the dock behind and stepping into the ruins of his former life. Leaving the harbor felt like stepping into a vast open-air tomb. The Bremen Eric remembered. The bustling avenues, the proud gabled houses, the trams clattering over the bridges, was gone. In its place was a labyrinth of canyons carved through mountains of rubble. He tried to orient himself, searching the skyline for familiar landmarks, but the skyline itself had been erased. Buildings were reduced to skeletal facades, their interiors spilled onto the pavement, a chaotic mixture of pulverized brick, splintered wood, and the intimate debris of lives interrupted. A fine dust hung permanently in the air, coating his tongue and settling into the wool of his American coat. The silence was profound, broken only by a rhythmic, persistent clinking, metal on stone. He rounded a corner and saw them, the Trimmerfrauen. Wrapped in scarves and men's coats, they worked in long human chains, passing bricks hand to hand from a collapsed bakery to a waiting cart. Their faces were etched with exhaustion, their movements mechanical. A few glanced at him, their eyes lingering on his healthy appearance and his sturdy boots, before returning to their work without acknowledgement. Their indifference was colder than the January wind. He walked for hours, his sense of direction failing him repeatedly. He thought of the endless, flat fields of Texas, the neat rows of cotton stretching to the horizon, the towns where not a single pane of glass was broken. That world felt impossibly distant, fevered dream of peace and order. Further on, a small child sat alone on a pile of rubble. The boy couldn't have been older than 5, his legs thin as sticks, his eyes enormous in a face pinched with hunger. As Eric passed, the child silently extended a hand. The gesture stopped Eric cold. Instinctively, without thinking, his hand went automatically to his coat pocket. His fingers searched for the familiar shape of a Hershey bar or a packet of gum, small luxuries that were common currency in Camp Hearn, easily obtained at the canteen. His fingers found only the rough lining of the empty pocket. The realization struck him with a dizzying force. He had nothing to give. The instinct of plenty, the assumption of surplus conditioned over 18 months of safety, evaporated in an instant. He was no longer the privileged prisoner. He was just another hungry man in a starving city. He pulled his hand from his pocket, shame washing over him, and hurried past the child. He navigated the treacherous paths, driven now by a desperate need to find something, anything, familiar. Finally, as the weak winter light began to fade, he recognized a twisted iron fence, the entrance to his old neighborhood. He turned the corner, his heart pounding with a fragile hope. He stopped. His street was there, but his home was not. Where the 4-story apartment building had stood, there was only a massive crater, partially filled with stagnant, icy water and surrounded by a chaotic field of pulverized stone. Eric stood at the edge of the void, the silence roaring in his ears. He tried to reconcile the memory of his mother's kitchen, the smell of rye bread and caraway, with the stagnant water and twisted rebar before him. It felt less like a site of destruction and more like an erasure. He dropped his duffel bag and began to circle the crater, stumbling over debris. He was looking for something, anything. A recognizable piece of furniture, a shard of familiar porcelain. But the bombing had been thorough. The blast had pulverized everything into anonymity. Despair, cold and sharp, began to set in. If the building was gone, where were his parents? He knew the statistics, the millions of displaced persons flooding Germany, the Red Cross tracing centers overwhelmed with inquiries. But statistics meant nothing when standing where your bedroom used to be. The possibility that he was now entirely alone, untethered in this ruined world, was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He sank onto a pile of relatively stable masonry, the cold penetrating his thick coat. The light was fading quickly, the weak winter sun disappearing behind the jagged silhouettes of the city. He had to find shelter. Then he heard it, a faint sound, cutting through the silence of the rubble field. It wasn't the clinking of the Trümmerfrauen or the distant rumble of a military vehicle. It was a baby crying. Eric stood up, alert. The sound was coming. From nearby, seemingly from underground. He moved cautiously toward it, navigating the treacherous terrain. Behind what remained of the neighboring building's facade, he found it. A makeshift entrance carved into the rubble. Charred beams shored up a narrow stairway leading down into a cellar. The smell of damp earth and watery soup wafted up from the darkness. People were living here, like cave dwellers in the heart of the city. As he approached, a figure emerged from the entrance, hauling a bucket of dirty water. It was a woman, prematurely aged, her face deeply lined and smeared with soot. She wore a man's coat belted with rope. She paused, looking up at the sky, and Eric recognized her instantly. "Frau Schmidt?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. She was the neighbor from the second floor, the one whose husband had been a tram conductor. A desperate surge of hope flooded him. A witness, someone who knew. Frau Schmidt turned sharply at the sound of her name. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of him. A tall, healthy-looking man in a clean military coat standing in the ruins. Recognition dawned, but it brought no warmth. Her expression hardened, shifting from weariness to a cold, impenetrable mask of resentment. "Frau Schmidt," Eric repeated, taking a hesitant step forward. "It's me, Eric Weber." She set the bucket down heavily, water sloshing over the rim onto the frozen ground. "I know who you are, boy." Her voice was flat, rasping. She wiped her raw, cracked hands on her apron. "You look good." She said the word good like she was spitting out a stone. "I just arrived today," Eric began, the words tumbling out in a rush of desperate hope. "My parents, the building. Do you know where they are? Were they evacuated?" Frau Schmidt gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. Evacuated? There was no evacuation. There was only the fire. She motioned toward the cellar entrance. Come down if you must. You're blocking what little light is left. Eric followed her down the narrow steps. The cellar was cramped and suffocatingly small. A single tallow candle flickered on a makeshift table, casting long shadows against the damp earth walls. The air was thick with the smell of Rübensuppe. Watery turnip soup, the staple diet of the hunger winter. A very young child, the source of the crying, lay bundled in a corner. My granddaughter, Frau Schmidt said, stirring the thin soup in a dented pot over a small, struggling fire. She turned to face him fully, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight. We heard stories about the camps in America, she said, her voice low and dangerous. We heard you had white bread, milk, that you played music while the sirens screamed here every night. Eric flinched. We worked hard, Frau Schmidt. We were prisoners. Prisoners? Her voice rose, cracking with grief. My sons were prisoners of the Eastern Front. They never came back. My husband died right here, buried under that rubble while trying to dig us out. She pointed a trembling finger at his coat. And you return looking like this? Fat and clean? The accusation hung in the air. Eric wanted to explain the guilt, the dissonance, the long, humid days in the cotton fields, but the words wouldn't come. In the face of her profound loss, his experience felt trivial. They call you people the Texas Cowboys, she hissed. Sitting in the sun while Germany burned. My boys died fighting. It would have been better if you had died in Normandy than come back to mock us with your health. The words were a knife twist. He was the survivor she couldn't tolerate. My parents, Eric whispered, desperate to find some anchor in the conversation. Frau Schmidt's expression turned completely desolate. They are gone, Eric. The big raid in March 45? Direct hit. There was nothing left to bury. She turned back to the soup. Now go. We have no food to spare for Amerikaner. She wouldn't look at him again. Eric climbed the stairs back into the cold twilight, the smell of the thin soup clinging to him, the words Texas Cowboy echoing in his ears. Eric climbed out of the cellar into a world rapidly losing its color. The twilight had deepened into a bruised purple, and the temperature plummeted with the setting sun. He was adrift in a hostile city, officially pronounced an orphan, and branded an outsider within the span of an hour. He needed shelter. The hunger winter was not merely a name, it was a physical reality that killed indiscriminately. Reports circulating before he left Texas indicated that the official ration in the British zone had sometimes dipped below 1,000 calories a day, a slow starvation sentence. The cold amplified the hunger, forcing the body to burn energy it didn't have. He found a doorway in what had once been a bank. The bronze doors were long gone, looted for scrap, but the stone archway offered some protection from the biting wind that whistled through the ruins. He huddled in the corner, drawing his knees up to his chest, the American greatcoat his only barrier against the freezing night. The silence allowed the day's trauma to settle. His parents were gone. Not missing, but annihilated. The finality was absolute, and Frau Schmidt's words, Texas Cowboy, clung to him like the frost forming on the stone. He had survived, yes, but his survival had cost him his place among his own people. He opened his duffel bag, needing to take stock of what he actually possessed. There was nothing of value except the clothes he wore and the item tucked securely at the bottom. He pulled out the oilcloth package. His fingers, already numb with cold, fumbled with the stiff wrapping. He unwrapped the skirt Palmolive soap. In the near darkness, the green bar seemed to glow faintly. The scent, that distinct artificial fragrance of palm and olive oils, was instantly recognizable and utterly alien. It cut through the smell of dust and ash. He held the soapets in his hand. It was heavy, smooth, unused. He thought of the showers at Camp Hearn, hot water, endless and pressurized, the easy lather, the ritual of washing away the sweat of the cotton fields. He remembered standing under the spray, letting the water beat down on him, safe and clean, while Bremen burned. Here, in this doorway, the object felt obscene, useless. There was no hot water. There was barely water to drink. The luxury it represented was a mockery of the landscape around him. To use it would be to confirm everything Frau Schmidt had accused him of. He quickly rewrapped the soapsegral, the smooth texture now repulsive to him. He stuffed it back into the bag. As the hunger gnawed at his stomach and the cold deepened in his bones, Eric realized he couldn't use it, not while the people around him were washing with sand. Eric woke with the first gray light, his joints stiff, and the cold settled deep in his bones. Survival demanded action. He needed work, and more immediately, he needed a Lebensmittelkarte, a ration card. Without it, he was officially a non-person in the meticulously organized scarcity of occupied Germany. He made his way to the district distribution office, housed in a relatively undamaged municipal building. A long queue already snaked around the block, hundreds of people huddled together, shuffling forward in resigned silence. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and quiet desperation. When he finally reached the front, after 3 hours, the clerk behind the counter, a thin man wearing a frayed collar, barely looked up. Eric presented his discharge papers. The clerk scrutinized the documents, his expression souring as he read the details. "Repatriated from America," the clerk noted, loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few heads turned, their gazes hostile. "I need a ration card application," Eric said, keeping his voice neutral. "You need proof of residence." "My residence was destroyed. I am currently sheltering at—" He gave the address of the rubble field. The clerk sighed, a sound of infinite weariness. "Then you are categorized as displaced. You must register with the housing authority first. We cannot issue cards without an address. Next." Dismissed. Eric stepped away, the bureaucratic hurdle feeling as impassable as the mountains of rubble outside. He saw others trading illicitly in the corners of the room, a few lumps of coal for a cigarette for a potato. The black market thrived where the official system failed, but Eric had nothing to trade. He walked back toward the neighborhood, the gnawing hunger in his stomach intensifying. The morning sun was weak, offering no warmth, merely illuminating the devastation with harsh clarity. As he approached the crater where his home once stood, he saw Frau Schmidt. She was kneeling by a puddle of murky water, partially covered by a thin layer of ice. She had broken the ice with a piece of brick. Before her was a small pile of soiled linens, her grandchild's diapers. Eric stopped and watched from the shadow of a collapsed wall. Her hands, already raw and red the night before, were now plunged into the icy water. She was scrubbing the cloth vigorously, but she had no soap. She was using a mixture of fine ash and pulverized brick dust scooped from the rubble. It was a futile, desperate attempt at cleanliness. The grit abraded the cloth, and the ash only seemed to grind the filth deeper. Her knuckles were split and bleeding. She rinsed, scrubbed again, and rinsed, her breath coming in ragged gasps from the exertion and the cold. Watching her struggle, the memory of her accusations, Texas cowboy, Amerikaner, faded. He didn't see a bitter accuser. He saw a grandmother fighting for a shred of dignity amidst the ruins. A profound sense of empathy washed over him, overriding his own fear of rejection. He knew the weight in his duffel bag. He finally had something worth offering. Eric stepped out from the shadows of the wall. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to startle her. Frau Schmidt heard the crunch of his boots on the frozen rubble and stiffened instantly. She turned her head, her eyes narrowed with the same hostility from the night before. She visibly braced herself, perhaps expecting him to beg for food or shelter. Eric stopped a few feet away. He said nothing. Words had failed him in the cellar. They felt useless now. The gap between his experience and hers couldn't be bridged by explanations. It could only be bridged by action. He knelt down and opened his duffel bag. His hands, though cold, were steady as he pulled out the oilcloth package. He unwrapped the Palmolive soap. The vibrant green bar seemed entirely out of place against the monochromatic gray of the ruins. As the wrapping fell away, the pungent, clean scent hit the cold air. It was so strong that Frau Schmidt recoiled slightly, confused by the fragrance. Still silent, Eric leaned forward and placed the soap on a flat stone next to her makeshift wash basin. Frau Schmidt stared at the object. It had likely been years since she had seen a full bar of real soap. During the war, and in the immediate aftermath, the populace was often issued Kriegsseife, a gritty, harsh substitute sometimes made of clay and sand, severely lacking in fats. This was different. This was an artifact of a world that still functioned. Eric watched her, his heart pounding. This was the physical manifestation of his guilt and his survival. By giving it away, he wasn't just offering a cleaning agent. He was acknowledging the disparity between them. He was attempting to shed the skin of the Amerikaner. Frau Schmidt's gaze shifted from the soap to Eric's face. Her expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of suspicion, pride, and desperate need. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of rubble clearing. Finally, she made a decision. Her cracked, bleeding hand reached out. She picked up the soap eye. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She turned back to the icy water, dipped the soap, and began to work it into the soiled linens. Almost instantly, a thin layer of white lather formed, a small, almost forgotten miracle. She scrubbed with renewed vigor, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as the soap did its work. She still didn't look at Eric, but she hadn't sent him away. Eric remained kneeling while Frau Schmidt finished the washing. He watched as she wrung out the linens with a fierce efficiency, the soap transforming the chore from a futile struggle into a productive task. When she was done, she spread the damp cloths over a relatively clean section of rubble to freeze dry in the weak winter air. Only then did she look at him again. She picked up the soap, now slightly softened at the edges, and studied it for a moment before wrapping it carefully in a rag. The hostility in her eyes had receded, replaced by a weary calculation. "Wait here," she commanded, her voice gruff, and disappeared down the cellar steps. Eric waited, listening to the persistent sounds of the city attempting to heal itself, the distant clinking of hammers, the scraping of shovels. The scale of the task was overwhelming. Millions of tons of debris had to be moved, one brick at a time, before any real construction could begin. Frau Schmidt emerged a few minutes later. In her hand, she held a dark object. She walked over to Eric and extended it to him. It was the heel of a loaf of bread. Dark, dense rye, hard as wood. In the economy of the hunger winter, it represented a significant portion of a daily ration. Eric accepted it, surprised. He hadn't expected payment. "We don't take charity from cowboys," she said flatly. The venom had gone out of the word. It was now a statement of pride, a preservation of dignity. "Thank you," Eric said. He bit into the bread. It was tough and tasted faintly of sawdust, a common adulterant in post-war flour, but it was the most substantial thing he had eaten since leaving the ship. As he chewed, he realized this was his first transaction in the new Germany. It wasn't a grand gesture of reconciliation or forgiveness, but a simple, pragmatic exchange of goods between survivors. The guilt associated with his time in Texas didn't vanish, but it felt less paralyzing. He understood that the gap between those who stayed and those who returned would take years to close. It wouldn't be healed by speeches, but by small, shared hardships. Frau Schmidt returned to her cellar without another word. Eric finished the bread and shouldered his duffel bag. He looked down at his American boots. They were scuffed and covered in gray dust now. They no longer looked new. He walked toward the sound of the work. Further down, the street, a line of men and women were clearing a collapsed warehouse. The slow, arduous process of Trümmerarbeit. Eric found the foreman, who handed him a shovel without asking for his papers. Eric took his place in the human chain. No one spoke to him, but no one told him to leave. He began to work, the rhythm of the labor familiar and grounding, adding his strength to the overwhelming task ahead. He was home.